when they do think of Vietnam, there's so much history and culture in the United States over the Vietnam War. But outside of that, there's not much understanding about what Vietnam is and the people there and any facts about it. And then the fifth episode is going to be basically post-Vietnam War. I know it's 20th century Vietnam. We'll get a little bit into the 21st century too, kind of see how that country is now and kind of reflect back on the past century. So with Vietnam, one of the very interesting things about the country is the shape of it. Vietnam has this very long shape that goes along the coastline of Southeast Asia. A lot of countries have interesting history with that, such as like Chile, depending on how you want to pronounce it. They have a long coastline which is separated by the Andes and splits southern South America between Argentina and Chile. And then you also have a country like Croatia. Croatia has a really long coastal border. But for Vietnam, that country geographically could be split into about 3 or 4 different sections. The most northern section would be called Dai Viet, and that is basically what is, it used to belong to China and has a lot of Chinese influence, but it was partly on the northern side of the Hong River. So a lot of that area, Chinese influence, and just south of that is Tonkin, as many people know. It's also got other names like Bac Bo, which I believe is the Vietnamese pronunciation of it. That may be completely wrong. I'm not very good at pronouncing Vietnamese words. And then we also have middle section, which is what you see in the very long, very narrow part of the country. Before I get into that, the Dai Viet area and the Tonkin area is what the original Vietnamese people lived in. That kind of became heavily influenced by China and was controlled oftentimes by China, where they served as their protectorate. Vietnamese people and kingdoms often had to send gifts and money and resources back to many of the dynasties. So we have this Dai Viet or Dai Vet and Tonkin area, which has much of the Vietnamese influence. And in the smaller, more thin section of Vietnam, which is the kind of the middle part, it is where the Champa people were. Champa people were more similar to kind of like the Indonesians or Polynesians. They were seafaring people who had colonized that land and kind of made it their home. Well, that was invaded by the Dai Viet kingdom, and it basically made part of Vietnam. So for, I'd say about 1,000 years, you had North Vietnam and the middle part of Vietnam being part of the Vietnamese Empire. Now, during this period of time, Vietnam saw constant warfare with China as they constantly fought for independence, or they fought for, and they really just fought for autonomy and to get away from China. You could often kind of describe the Vietnamese. Yes, in this middle section is also known as Annam, or the Vietnamese word for it is Trong Bo, which again, I probably pronounced that wrong. But like I said, there was many fighting between Vietnamese people and the Chinese dynasties. During this fighting, a lot of people ended up moving out of that Vietnamese area and going south into the Kingdom of Khmer, which I may have pronounced that wrong, but that was a Southeast Asian kingdom for a while. And these Vietnamese people had moved into that area, which is kind of where Saigon is, known as Nam Bo, or Kochi, China, as it was kind of known by the Europeans. Now, part of the Vietnamese moving south is a little similar, but not. Kind of when we Westerners think of what manifest destiny is, of Americans moving from the east to the west on the North American continent, the Vietnamese had something called Nam Tien, which means southward expansion. And that was kind of an idea of moving Vietnam and the Vietnamese people south into new lands and kind of making that part of their kingdom and kind of being independent from China. So that's kind of the geography of Vietnam and really how the country came together. One thing I will say, when it comes to what made the Annam section of Vietnam, the middle part, very thin, is the Anamati Mountains. And that kind of separates Laos and Vietnam, which in Laos is another country in Southeast Asia. At some time during the 17th century, missionaries from France were moving into Vietnam and influencing the people, converting a lot of them to Catholic, which did kind of become a big problem for the Vietnamese kingdom. And they were already having issues like they've had for 1,000 years with China. So now they're just having these issues with France, of France trying to come in and take over Vietnam as its own and make it part of its own government. So these missionaries were seen as a threat and as a way to take over Vietnam. So a lot of French missionaries in Vietnam were persecuted, killed, sometimes just sent back to France or where else. But they weren't really accepted by the government. So in 1859, Napoleon III ordered soldiers and gunboats to move into central Vietnam, where they fired upon a city and took over small parts of land and attacked Saigon too, and took over basically Cochinchina, the southern part of Vietnam. And over a series of several wars, and in that conflict, France had the help of Spanish troops and Filipino troops, along with their own French troops, who invaded Vietnam. And over several years, they took more and more land. Then we have like the country of Cambodia, which signed over basically they basically signed over their autonomy to France, so France would protect them. Lands in Laos and Siam were taken through different wars. And also there was wars with China, where France fought China in kind of the Opium Wars, but also a lot of that had to deal with French fighting for control of Vietnam. And because China had been controller of Vietnam for 1,000 years, and now France was here stepping in and wanted to take over this country. And so there was wars between China and France, which kind of gave the northern part of Vietnam to French Indochina. So through a series of wars with Siam and China, France consolidated their power in Southeast Asia. And at that time, the only Southeast kingdoms that you would really have left was French Indochina, Burma, which was part of the British Empire at the time, and Siam. France actually had planned to take over Siam since they had already taken so much other parts from that nation, or from the kingdom of Siam. But Siam actually signed an agreement to be protected by the British. So if France were to invade Siam, then they would more likely see a war with England or Britain. So they never fully invaded the rest of Siam. French Indochina was established in 1887 after it did take in Cambodia, and then years later, like I said, slowly capturing more and more land through Siam. So to give some more background on French Indochina, when Napoleon III had sent troops over into Vietnam, it was originally just to help Catholic. Now that was kind of the reasoning and the public information of why it was happening. Now, of course, once they did go in and protect the Catholic missionaries and make deals with the Vietnamese kingdom, land was ceded to France, which was not the original purpose, and more ports were opened for French trade. This was also a time during the Age of Imperialism. The Age of Imperialism is a little bit different from the colonial period, which people often get confused with those. The colonial period mostly involved small colonies in Africa and Asia, mostly from like Portuguese, Dutch explorers, and even some Spanish explorers who went around Africa into India and Southeast Asia, establishing small trading ports and towns. Portugal really led this during the colonial period. And then you, of course, see the colonization of North and South America. Now, the age of imperialism was kind of the second phase of the colonial period, because much of what could be colonized was colonized by the 1850s, and really when the imperialism became a big ideology in the Western world. What imperialism involved, and the biggest differences between that and colonialism, is colonialism often involved people moving from one region of their home country into a new colonized region, like North America. For example, many British citizens or English citizens had moved into North America and into like the Virginia colonies, many for to get away from religious persecution, and some just to get better benefits of, more economic opportunity. While imperialism was land that was either too dangerous for people to get to previously, and some of this is like the Amazon, much of interior Africa, and Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of jungles and wooded areas that was often hard for European boats and soldiers to move through. Another part of imperialism has to deal with the ethnocentric ideologies. Ethnocentrism is basically the idea that my race my race and my people and culture are superior to all others, and those who aren't part of my culture need to become part of it so they can realize that it's what their true benefits are. That's how many, you still had these African societies of hunter and gatherer tribes, and the Europeans often felt that it was savagery, and I can't believe these people still hunt with spears when we have rifles now. And it was just kind of this egotistical ideology for all of Europe. And to look more specifically into that, we also have the scramble for Africa, which is one of the biggest components of imperialism. Now, much like Southeast Asia with French and British influence, Africa was split up between many European countries. And some of these weren't even colonial powers, like Germany, Italy, Belgium. All these countries colonized part of Africa and other areas of the world that were now accessible, who have never been colonial powers before. These three countries had just formed. Before that, Germany was made up of Prussia and a series of city-states in the Holy Roman Empire. Italy was made up of city-states, and Belgium was part of France at the time and eventually gained their independence. But a lot of this had to do with a balance of power in Europe, where these nations were taking land to further their power, and at some point, once all this land was taken up, then they had to look at new ways for power to be taken. Also, these countries had tons of resources that were used by Europeans and Americans too, really just the Western countries. If you ever read the book Heart of Darkness, it is about, and a lot of people think of the Vietnam movie about that, but the original book was about the Belgium government in the Congo who would do horrible things to the Congolese people, and they would harvest their rubber trees, and if they didn't harvest enough, they would often do stuff like cut off their hands. It was just a terrible thing that happened, but it was seen in many places across the world that Europe kind of took control over. So resources became another big part of it. And with that ethnocentrism, religion was a big aspect too. A lot of people believed not only are we better because of what we do and how we do it, but also because of our God. Our God is the only God, and anyone else who denies that is wrong. So Christianity became a big thing that was also being spread through these newly conquered territories. Now, France was a pretty big power during the colonial period. After the French and Indian War, though, they had lost much of their land in North America to the British. And after Napoleon took over, they basically lost all they had left, which was known as the Louisiana Purchase. They had sold that to the United States to fund the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in eventually a French loss, where now France has been humiliated for years. They're losing their colonies, and they kind of felt this new new sense of we need to get back our power. So we're still being able to compete with these other places like Spain and Britain. And so France really started expanding into, they expanded into Africa, taking areas like Algeria and many other places. Napoleon III, who is the same person who wanted Vietnam conquered under the French Empire, also tried to conquer Mexico in the 1860s as a way to expand the French Empire, which overall still ended in a Mexican victory, completely wiping the French off North America, other than a few colonies in the Caribbean and, their South American colony as well. But yeah, that's a little background of what France had really done to expand its imperialism and what kind of led it to taking over Vietnam. Now, once it had taken Vietnam and really had established French Indochina, this area became highly valuable to France. So originally, most of their income from this area came from taxing the local population. They would send them stuff like opium, salt, rice, alcohol, things like that. Very popular among the Vietnamese people who paid taxes and was sent back to France. And eventually, France started taking advantage of Vietnamese resources, stuff like zinc, tin, coal, rice, rubber, coffee, and tea. These were all cultivated and also sold back to France at very cheap prices. And by 1920, French Indochina had actually produced 40% of the income for the French Empire. This area was extremely valuable for France. One interesting fact I had about France was many people know the company Michelin Tires. It was actually a French company that grew into such a large company that we know today from taking rubber from Vietnam. So the rubber resources, and I guess from rubber trees that was harvested in Vietnam, is what grew and started the Michelin company. So every time you look at the Michelin Man, you can think, oh, he wouldn't be around if it wasn't for Vietnamese resources. So this is episode 1 of the History Haven podcast. Like I said, next episode, I will be covering Ho Chi Minh and the lead up to World War II.